The downpour struck the windshield with the fury of 1,000 hammers, each droplet exploding against the glass in a relentless assault that made visibility nearly impossible. Marcus Brennan hunched forward in his seat, his weathered fingers wrapped tightly around the steering wheel as he squinted through the deluge, trying to make out the blurred yellow lines that marked the edges of the Washington highway. Thunder rolled across the sky like the grinding of enormous gears, and lightning split the darkness in jagged white forks that illuminated the world for brief, brilliant seconds before plunging everything back into shadow. The clock on his dashboard read 11:47, and every muscle in his body screamed with exhaustion after a 15-hour shift at the construction site where he worked as a foreman. His shoulders ached from hauling lumber. His back throbbed from bending over blueprints, and his eyes burned from the combination of fatigue and the constant strain of navigating through this biblical storm. He had almost missed them entirely. If lightning hadn't flashed at precisely that moment, if his headlights hadn't caught the edge of the bus shelter just as he rounded the curve, he would have driven right past and never known they were there. But the universe had other plans that Tuesday night, because in that split second of illumination, Marcus saw two huddled shapes pressed against the back wall of the shelter, a woman holding a small child against her chest, both of them drenched despite their meager protection from the storm. Something in the way the woman cradled that little girl, something in the protective curve of her body and the desperate way she clutched the child close, made Marcus's foot slam down on the brake pedal before any conscious thought could form in his mind. The truck fishtailed slightly on the wet pavement, tires hissing through standing water as he pulled onto the shoulder and threw the vehicle into park. Rain hammered down on Marcus the instant he opened his door and stepped out into the maelstrom. Within seconds, water had soaked through his heavy canvas jacket, plastered his hair to his scalp, and run in cold rivulets down the back of his neck. He jogged toward the shelter, boots splashing through puddles that had formed across the sidewalk, and as he got closer, he could make out more details through the sheets of rain. The woman looked young, perhaps in her early 30s, with dark hair that hung in wet ropes around a face marked by exhaustion and something deeper, something that looked like the complete absence of hope. She wore medical scrubs under a thin windbreaker that offered virtually no protection against the elements, and in her arms she held a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, blonde-haired and pale-faced, shivering violently despite being wrapped in what appeared to be her mother's sweater. Marcus called out as he approached, his voice fighting to be heard over the thunder that cracked overhead like the splitting of enormous trees. The woman's head jerked up, and he saw her eyes, saw the raw fear and desperation that lived there, saw the way she instinctively pulled her daughter closer as if preparing to defend against another blow from a world that had clearly already dealt her too many. He stopped a few feet away, keeping his hands visible, keeping his posture non-threatening, understanding on some intuitive level that this woman had been pushed to her absolute limit, and any sudden movement might send her fleeing into the storm. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely audible over the rain, thin and cracked like old paper, and the lie she told was so transparent that it physically hurt Marcus to hear it. She claimed they were fine, claimed they were just waiting for a bus, claimed everything was under control, even as her entire body shook with cold, and her daughter whimpered softly against her chest. Marcus had seen enough desperation in his own life to recognize it instantly in someone else. He kept his voice gentle as he explained that they were both at serious risk of hypothermia, that he had a son waiting for him at home with a babysitter, that he was heading back there right now and could easily give them a ride anywhere they needed to go. Hospital, police station, wherever they needed to be, he would take them, no questions asked. The woman's composure shattered like glass. Her face crumpled, and tears began streaming down her cheeks to mix with the rainwater already there, and for a long moment she seemed unable to speak at all. When the words finally came, they emerged as a broken whisper that carried the weight of complete defeat. She didn't have anywhere to go. 6 words that hung in the wet air between them like a confession of failure, like an admission that every safety net had failed, that every resource had been exhausted, that she had reached the absolute end of her options and found nothing there but empty darkness. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, some locked door creaking open after years of being bolted shut. He knew that look, knew it intimately, because he had worn it himself once upon a time when his own world had collapsed around him and left him standing in the wreckage with nothing but his small son and a mountain of debt. 23 minutes later, Marcus was unlocking the front door of his modest rental house, a 2-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Bellingham, and ushering the shivering woman and child inside while rain continued to hammer against the roof overhead. His neighbor, Mrs. Rosa Chen, a retired schoolteacher who watched his son whenever Marcus had to work late, gathered her knitting and her purse when he quickly explained that an emergency had come up and thanked her for staying so late. She gave him a knowing look, her wise old eyes taking in the bedraggled woman and child standing in his entryway, and patted his arm gently before letting herself out into the storm. Marcus moved into action immediately, his exhaustion temporarily forgotten as he focused on the practical necessities of the situation. He pulled towels from the linen closet, soft and clean-smelling from the dryer, and handed them to the woman along with one of his flannel shirts and a pair of sweatpants that would be too large for her but at least would be dry. He directed her to the bathroom down the hall, told her to take all the time she needed, and suggested she might want to take a warm shower to chase away the cold that had settled deep into her bones. While she was gone, he checked on his 8-year-old son Daniel and found the boy sprawled across his bed with a comic book open on his chest, mouth slightly open in sleep, looking peaceful and innocent in a way that always made Marcus's heart clench with a combination of love and protective fear. He returned to the kitchen and put water on to boil, pulling down mugs and tea bags, his hands moving through the familiar motions while his mind raced ahead to all the complications this decision was going to create. He was inviting strangers into his home, into his son's life, based on nothing more than a gut feeling and his own memories of desperation. It could be a terrible mistake. But as he heard the bathroom door open and soft footsteps padding down the hallway, he knew he would make the same choice again, because the alternative was leaving them out there in that storm with nowhere to go. The woman emerged from the bathroom, looking marginally more human, though the haunted expression in her eyes hadn't diminished. The little girl was wrapped in a large towel and wearing one of Daniel's old shirts, and her blonde hair had been combed back from her face, revealing delicate features and large blue eyes that watched Marcus with curiosity rather than fear. He gestured to the kitchen table, invited them to sit, and poured hot tea into mugs, sliding one across to the woman along with sugar and milk. She wrapped her hands around the mug as if trying to absorb its warmth directly into her bloodstream, and for a long moment she simply stared down at the amber liquid, her shoulders hunched in a posture of defeat. Then, slowly, haltingly, she began to talk. Her name was Eleanor Morrison, and the little girl was her daughter Lily. She had worked as a registered nurse at Cascade Regional Medical Center for almost 7 years, a single mother from the day Lily was born, because the child's father had walked out the moment he learned about the pregnancy, declared he wasn't ready for the responsibility of fatherhood, and vanished from her life without a backward glance. 6 weeks ago, the hospital had been acquired by a massive healthcare corporation that immediately began implementing cost-cutting measures with ruthless efficiency. Corporate restructuring, they called it, though the people losing their jobs called it something else entirely. 22 nurses had been let go in a single day, including Elena, replaced by newer graduates willing to work for lower wages and lacking the experience to demand better treatment. Just like that, 7 years of dedication and skill and long night shifts had been reduced to a severance package that barely covered 2 months of rent. Marcus listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening as the story unfolded. Elena described the weeks of desperate job searching that followed, sending applications to every hospital and clinic within a 100-mile radius, calling in every professional favor she had accumulated, networking until her voice went hoarse from explaining her situation over and over again. But word spread quickly in the medical community, and the taint of a mass layoff followed her everywhere. Hiring managers asked pointed questions about why she'd been let go, implied that there must have been performance issues, suggested that perhaps she should consider a career change. The rejection letters piled up until she stopped opening them. Her savings, already depleted from single parenthood and the constant expenses of raising a child alone, evaporated with terrifying speed. Lily had chronic asthma, a condition that required expensive daily medication and regular monitoring, and Elena refused to compromise on her daughter's health even as the bills mounted higher. The rent on their apartment came due and then came due again, and she found herself making increasingly desperate bargains with her landlord, promising payment extensions she had no real hope of meeting, watching the man's patience wear thinner with each conversation until it finally snapped entirely. Yesterday morning, Elena had woken to find an eviction notice taped to her door, giving her until 5 o'clock that afternoon to vacate the premises or face forcible removal. She had spent the day making frantic phone calls to everyone she had ever considered a friend, reaching out to people she hadn't spoken to in years, swallowing her pride, and begging for help in a way that made her stomach churn with humiliation. Her parents had passed away in a car accident when she was in her 20s, leaving her without that safety net that so many people took for granted. She had no siblings, no extended family within 1,000 miles, and her so-called friends proved to have remarkably convenient excuses for why they couldn't help. She had spent her last $50 on a storage unit for the few possessions she couldn't bear to abandon, cramming boxes and furniture into the small space in a blur of activity while the clock ticked down toward that 5 o'clock deadline. By the time the hour arrived, she was standing on the sidewalk with 2 duffel bags containing everything she had managed to carry, watching as her former landlord changed the locks on her apartment door with the grim efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. The rest of her belongings, everything she hadn't been able to fit in the storage unit or carry on her back, were simply gone, claimed by the landlord as compensation for unpaid rent or possibly thrown into a dumpster somewhere, and Elena would never know which. She had called 4 different homeless shelters, working her way through a list she had found online, her voice growing more desperate with each call as she learned that every single facility was operating at maximum capacity with waiting lists that stretched for weeks. By 7 in the evening, with darkness falling and the storm clouds gathering overhead, Elena had found herself simply sitting on a bench near a bus stop, Lily huddled against her side, with absolutely no idea what to do next. When the rain began, they had moved to the shelter, and she had wrapped her daughter in every piece of clothing she could spare, and they had waited there for hours while Elena's mind spun uselessly in circles, unable to formulate any plan beyond surviving the night. Marcus felt his throat constrict as the story reached its conclusion. He had to clear it twice before he could speak, and when the words came out they were rougher than he intended. She would stay here, he told her firmly. She and Lily would stay here, in his home, at least until she could get back on her feet and figure out her next steps. He had a spare room, currently serving as a home office with a futon that he used for reading, but it was warm and dry and comfortable enough for temporary accommodation. Elena's head snapped up, her eyes wide with something that might have been hope, but looked more like disbelief. She immediately began protesting that she couldn't possibly accept, that he didn't even know her, that she was a complete stranger and he had no reason to take such a risk on someone he had just met on the side of the road in a rainstorm. Marcus cut through her objections with quiet insistence, explaining that he knew everything he needed to know. He knew she was a mother who would rather sit in freezing rain than put her child in any kind of danger. He knew she was a skilled professional who had been crushed by corporate greed and a system that valued profit margins over human lives, and he knew exactly what it felt like to need help desperately and find none available, because he had been there himself not so long ago. His voice softened as he continued, explaining that he couldn't solve all her problems with a single gesture, couldn't magically restore her job or her apartment or the life she had lost, but he could offer her a safe place to sleep tonight and a foundation from which to rebuild. The rest they would figure out together, one day at a time, one problem at a time, until she was strong enough to stand on her own again. Eleanor covered her face with both hands, and her shoulders began to shake with sobs that she had clearly been holding back for weeks, all the grief and fear and exhaustion finally breaking through the wall she had built to keep functioning for her daughter's sake. Marcus slid a box of tissues across the table and then stood and moved to the other side of the kitchen, giving her the space and privacy to fall apart without an audience, understanding that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for someone was look away while they cracked open. When she finally raised her face, her eyes were swollen and red-rimmed, but searching, trying to understand the motivation behind his offer, trying to figure out what he wanted from her, because surely no one helped strangers without expecting something in return. She asked him directly why he was doing this, what he hoped to gain, and Marcus found himself pausing before answering, his gaze drifting down the darkened hallway toward his son's room. 4 years ago, he began slowly. His wife had died. Cancer, the ovarian kind that metastasized before anyone even knew it was there, that spread through her body like wildfire despite every treatment they threw at it. Stage 4 by the time the doctors identified it, and the prognosis had been measured in months rather than years. Elena's hand moved instinctively across the table in a gesture of sympathy, and Marcus continued with the story he rarely told anyone, the story of those 18 months of desperate fighting against an enemy they could never defeat. They had tried everything the medical establishment could offer. Chemotherapy that left his wife so sick she could barely lift her head. Radiation that burned her skin and made her cry in pain. Experimental treatments that required them to travel to specialized clinics in other states, staying in cheap motels and maxing out credit cards for procedures that insurance refused to cover. They had sold their nice furniture and bought second-hand replacements. They had drained their savings account to zero. They had taken out loans against their house, borrowed money from family members, started a crowdfunding campaign that raised a fraction of what they needed. Nothing had been enough, and she had died anyway, leaving Marcus with a 4-year-old son, who barely understood why Mommy had gone away and wasn't coming back. The medical debt had been crushing, a mountain so high Marcus couldn't see the top of it. Bills that arrived daily, demanding payment for procedures that hadn't saved his wife's life. It had taken him 2 years of aggressive payment plans and careful budgeting and sacrifice after sacrifice to finally crawl out from under that burden. He had lost their house in the process, unable to maintain the mortgage payments while also servicing the debt, and most of their possessions had been sold off piece by piece to generate cash. He had moved into this rental with just the bare necessities and his son's favorite toys, starting over from nearly nothing. The hardest part, Marcus explained, his voice going rough with remembered pain, hadn't been the financial struggle. It had been the emotional shutdown that followed. For 2 years after his wife's death, he had simply existed rather than lived, going through the motions of parenthood and work and basic survival without really engaging with any of it. Wake up at dawn, get Daniel fed and dressed, drop him at daycare, work a construction job for 10 or 12 or 14 hours, pick Daniel up, feed him dinner, put him to bed, collapse into exhausted sleep. Repeat. Day after day after day, each one exactly like the last, a grey, monotonous march through time that felt like walking through heavy fog with no destination in sight. He had shut himself away from everyone who cared about him. Friends had stopped calling after their invitations were declined too many times. His family back in Colorado had offered to take Daniel for a while, give Marcus some space to grieve and heal, but he had refused with something close to violence, because Daniel was all he had left of his wife, the only good thing remaining in his shattered world, and he would rather die than be separated from his son even temporarily. But his grief had made him a ghost, present in body but absent in spirit, unable to give Daniel the love and attention and emotional support that a child desperately needed. Elena asked what had changed, what had finally broken through that fog, and Marcus's laugh was hollow and devoid of humor. Nothing had changed, he admitted. Not really. He was still going through many of those same motions today, still struggling to figure out how to be enough for Daniel when he felt half empty himself. But tonight, seeing Elena and Lily huddled in that bus shelter with nowhere to go and no one to help them, he had seen his own past reflected back at him. He had seen himself and Daniel 4 years ago, drowning in circumstances beyond their control, desperate for someone to throw them a lifeline that never came. Perhaps the only way to give meaning to suffering was to use the lessons learned from it to help someone else going through the same experience. No one had been there for Marcus when he needed it most, when he was buried under debt and grief and the overwhelming responsibility of single parenthood. Maybe he could be that person for Elena, could offer the support and stability that he wished someone had offered him, could break the cycle of people turning away from those in need because it was inconvenient or uncomfortable. Fresh tears spilled down Elena's face, but her expression had transformed. The desperation and fear had been replaced by something else, something that looked like gratitude mixed with disbelief, and she was smiling despite the tears. She thanked him, her voice breaking on the words, thanked him over and over until Marcus had to gently tell her it was enough, that thanks weren't necessary, that they were going to get through this together. Morning light crept through the windows with the pale grey quality of the day after a storm, the world outside scrubbed clean and glistening with moisture. Marcus woke to the sound of an excited voice cutting through his exhaustion. Daniel's voice pitched high with surprise and curiosity as he called from the living room. Marcus stumbled out of his bedroom, his body protesting the abbreviated sleep, and found his son standing in the doorway to the spare room, staring wide-eyed at the small blonde girl who was still curled up on the futon, deeply asleep under the blankets Marcus had provided the night before. He steered Daniel away from the doorway and toward the kitchen, keeping his voice low and calm as he explained that they had guests who needed help, that a mother and her daughter had nowhere to stay and would be living with them for a little while. Daniel listened with that serious expression he got when processing important information, his dark eyebrows drawn together in concentration, and Marcus could see his wife's features reflected in their son's face, could see the intelligence and empathy that she had passed down before cancer took her away. Daniel asked if the guests would be staying for a long time, and Marcus admitted he wasn't sure, explained that it depended on a lot of factors they would have to work through together, and emphasized that he needed Daniel to be on his very best behavior because the little girl had been through some difficult experiences. His son nodded solemnly, processing this information with care, and then said something that made Marcus's heart clench painfully in his chest. Daniel observed that it sounded like what they had gone through when Mommy got sick, and that he remembered how hard everything had been during that time, and that if nobody had helped them back then, maybe they should help these people now, because they understood what it was like. Marcus pulled his son into a fierce hug, holding him close while trying not to let Daniel see the tears that had sprung to his eyes. The wisdom in those simple words, the empathy and understanding from an 8-year-old child, nearly broke something open inside Marcus that he had been keeping carefully sealed. He agreed that Daniel was absolutely right, that they should help because they understood, and he felt grateful beyond words that his son had grown into someone capable of that kind of compassion despite everything they had lost. Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later with Lily balanced on her hip, both of them looking more rested than they had the night before, but still carrying the exhaustion of people who had been running on empty for too long. She immediately began apologizing for imposing, for disrupting their morning routine, for being an inconvenience, and Marcus cut her off by gesturing to the kitchen table and offering to make pancakes, which were the only thing he knew how to cook with any real competence, and even that was debatable. Over breakfast, the two children observed each other with the cautious curiosity of young animals meeting for the first time. Lily gradually emerged from her shell as the food and warmth worked their magic, transforming from a silent, wide-eyed waif into a remarkably talkative child, who chatted about her lost stuffed rabbit named Mr. Whiskers and how he had been her favorite toy in the whole world. Daniel listened attentively and then declared with the confidence of someone who had learned practical skills from necessity that he could probably make her a new stuffed animal, because his dad had taught him how to sew buttons back on clothes after his mom passed away, and while a rabbit was more complicated than a button, he thought they could figure it out together. The look Elena gave Marcus over the children's heads conveyed gratitude so profound that words would have diminished it, and Marcus felt something shift in his chest, some small crack appearing in the wall he had built around his heart. Days accumulated into weeks with surprising speed, and a routine established itself almost organically, the four of them finding a rhythm that worked despite its complete lack of planning. Marcus woke before dawn each morning, as he had for years, and left for construction sites while the house still slept. Elena took over the morning routine, getting both children fed and dressed, packing lunches and brushing hair, and handling the 1,000 small tasks that mornings with children required. She walked them to Riverside Elementary School, a 15-minute trek through the neighborhood that Daniel had been making alone until Elena insisted she accompany them. Appalled that an 8-year-old had been navigating city sidewalks unsupervised. Daniel had immediately insisted that Lily should attend his school rather than being enrolled somewhere unfamiliar, and Marcus had spent an entire day navigating bureaucratic paperwork and making phone calls until he managed to arrange temporary enrollment with the help of a sympathetic principal who understood the situation. Lily started classes the following Monday, assigned to the first-grade classroom where she quickly attached herself to Daniel's protection like a barnacle to a ship, following him around the playground and waiting by his classroom door during recess so they could spend the breaks together. Elena used the quiet hours while the children were at school to rebuild her professional life from the ground up. She made phone calls from Marcus's living room, sending out application after application with renewed determination now that she had stable housing and wasn't making calls from a bench in the rain. She researched every medical facility within commuting distance, networked with former colleagues who might know about openings, and slowly began to hear back with interview requests that gradually transformed into callbacks, and then actual offers. Marcus came home each evening to find dinner cooking on the stove, and the house filled with something it hadn't contained in 4 years. The sound of laughter and conversation, and life being lived rather than simply endured. He found himself actually looking forward to the end of his workday, his truck turning toward home with genuine anticipation rather than resigned obligation. Elena had a gift for creating warmth where there had been only emptiness, for drawing people out of their shells with gentle questions and patient listening. The children's friendship deepened with remarkable speed, as childhood friendships often do when unencumbered by adult complications. Lily brought chaos and enthusiasm that balanced Daniel's more serious nature, while Daniel provided stability and protection that allowed Lily to feel safe enough to simply be a child again. They played elaborate games that involved complicated rules only they understood, built forts from sofa cushions, drew pictures that covered the refrigerator, and argued with the casual intensity of siblings rather than strangers who had met only weeks before. 4 weeks after that rainy night, Elena received a call back from a family medicine clinic in the suburbs, a small practice looking for an experienced nurse to handle patient intake and coordinate care. 3 days later, she had a formal job offer with decent pay and reasonable hours. She came home that evening practically glowing with relief and pride, and over their now ritual evening tea after the children were asleep, she told Marcus the news and explained that within a month she should have enough saved for first and last month's rent on a new apartment. Marcus felt something sink heavily in his stomach, a leaden weight that surprised him with its intensity. He realized with startling clarity that he didn't want them to leave, that the past 4 weeks had transformed his house from a space where he and Daniel merely existed into a home where 4 people actually lived. He found himself admitting this out loud, the words coming before he could second-guess them, explaining that for the first time since his wife died, the house felt alive rather than like a mausoleum. Elena studied him carefully across the table, her dark eyes searching his face for something, and then she suggested quietly that maybe they didn't have to leave, that maybe they could stay if that was what everyone wanted, that she would pay rent, of course, and contribute to household expenses, and they would figure out the logistics as they went along. Marcus agreed immediately, perhaps too eagerly, but he couldn't bring himself to care about appearing desperate or too eager, because the alternative was watching them walk out the door and returning to the grey silence that had been his life for so long. Something was shifting between them, some current flowing beneath the surface of their practical arrangements and shared responsibilities, but neither was ready to acknowledge it directly. They were both too damaged, too cautious, too aware of how much they had to lose if they misread the situation. Months accumulated with the steady inevitability of seasons changing. Fall surrendered to winter's grip, bringing cold that made the house feel even cozier and snow that transformed the neighborhood into something magical through children's eyes. Elena's presence continued to alter the house in small, incremental ways that somehow added up to something profound. She painted Lily's room a soft lavender color, taking her time with careful brushstrokes until the walls glowed with warmth. She organized the kitchen with an efficiency that came from years of managing a household alone, finding homes for items that had been shoved randomly into cabinets. She brought home flowers from the grocery store and arranged them in vases on the windowsills, adding splashes of color and life to spaces that had been purely functional. But more significant than any physical changes were the ways Elena managed to reach parts of Marcus that he had thought were dead and buried alongside his wife. She drew him into real conversations that went beyond logistics and schedules, asked questions about his day that went deeper than superficial pleasantries, shared observations and jokes that made him laugh with genuine amusement rather than polite obligation. She coaxed him back toward engagement with life, gently and patiently, never pushing but always inviting. Daniel blossomed under the renewed attention and warmth, his quiet sadness gradually lifting like fog, burning off under morning sun. He talked more freely about his feelings, brought home report cards with improved grades, started participating in school activities he had previously avoided. He smiled more, laughed more, seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight he had been carrying had finally been lifted from his small shoulders. His teachers commented on the positive changes during parent-teacher conferences, noting that Daniel seemed happier and more engaged with his peers. Lily transformed from a frightened, clingy child into a confident force of nature who bossed Daniel around with the casual authority of someone who had finally found her footing in the world. She sang while doing homework, danced around the living room to imaginary music, told elaborate stories about the adventures she and Daniel would have when they grew up. She no longer flinched at loud noises or clung desperately to her mother when meeting new people, the hypervigilance gradually fading as she learned that this place was safe, that these people wouldn't abandon her, that she could relax her guard. Late at night, after homework was completed and teeth were brushed and bedtime stories were read and the children were finally asleep, Marcus and Elena fell into the habit of sitting together on the front porch, regardless of weather, wrapped in blankets when the cold bit too sharply, drinking tea and talking about everything and nothing. They discussed Elena's challenging patience and Marcus's frustrating projects at work, analyzed the children's latest antics and developmental milestones, debated politics and books and movies and ideas, but underneath every conversation ran that current, that awareness of each other that had been building steadily since the first week, a magnetic pull that both felt but neither acknowledged. One particularly cold evening in January, they sat closer than usual, sharing a blanket against the winter chill, and their hands nearly touched on the armrest between their chairs. Both pulled back as if shocked, and an awkward silence fell. Elena broke it by suggesting vaguely that they should probably maintain certain boundaries, and Marcus agreed quickly, both of them citing the children as the reason for caution. Neither said what they were actually thinking, which was that the attraction between them had grown too strong to ignore, and that pretending otherwise was becoming increasingly difficult. The tension simmered beneath the surface for weeks after that near touch, coloring every interaction with a charge that made simple moments feel weighted with significance. Passing in the narrow hallway required them to turn sideways to avoid contact. Cooking together in the kitchen became a dance of careful space management. Sitting on the same couch to watch movies with the children meant maintaining a precise distance that felt both necessary and agonizing. February brought a health scare that forced everything into sharp focus. Elena developed a severe respiratory infection that progressed rapidly from a persistent cough to a high fever and difficulty breathing. Marcus came home from work on a Thursday to find her in bed, flushed and shaking, and immediately called their doctor, who advised bringing her to urgent care. He arranged for Mrs. Chen to watch the children and drove Elena to the clinic, where she was diagnosed with pneumonia and prescribed a course of strong antibiotics with strict orders to rest completely for at least a week. Marcus took 3 days off work, burning through personal leave he had been saving, to care for Elena while she was at her most vulnerable. He brought her soup and medicine on a precise schedule, changed her sweat-soaked sheets, monitored her temperature obsessively, and tried not to let her see how terrified he was. The fear of losing someone else he cared about came roaring back with the force of a freight train, all the trauma from his wife's illness suddenly raw and present again, as if no time had passed at all. Elena noticed his barely controlled panic despite her fever-induced haze. On the second day, when he brought her lunch with hands that trembled slightly, she took his wrist gently and made him sit on the edge of the bed. She reminded him firmly that this was pneumonia, not cancer, that she was responding well to the antibiotics, that she wasn't going anywhere. Marcus tried to maintain his composure, but his voice betrayed him when he admitted he couldn't go through that again. Couldn't watch someone he cared about slip away despite every effort to save them. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady as she explained that he couldn't protect himself from loss by shutting down emotionally every time someone got sick. Fear was natural and reasonable, but it couldn't be allowed to control him or prevent him from being present in the moment. They needed to talk about these things openly rather than letting unspoken fears fester and grow toxic. Running from vulnerability wasn't the same as strength. and hiding from feelings didn't make them disappear. It was the first of many difficult conversations they would have over the coming months, learning to communicate fears and needs and boundaries with the honesty that sustainable relationships required. They talked about Marcus's tendency to withdraw when stressed, about Elena's inclination to push herself too hard, trying to prove her independence. They discussed their individual trauma and how it manifested in their behavior patterns, acknowledged their triggers, and worked to develop healthier responses. The conversations were often painful, forcing them both to examine aspects of themselves they would have preferred to leave unexplored. But they created a foundation of understanding and trust that ran deeper than surface attraction. They learned to fight fairly when disagreements arose, to apologize sincerely when they hurt each other, to forgive mistakes without keeping score. They learned that love wasn't about finding someone perfect, but about choosing to grow alongside someone imperfect, to extend grace when it was needed most, to show up even when showing up was hard. Elena recovered from her pneumonia and returned to work, but something had shifted between her and Marcus during those vulnerable days. The walls they had been maintaining around their feelings had developed significant cracks, and pretending the attraction didn't exist became impossible. They began allowing themselves small touches that lingered a moment too long, holding eye contact that communicated volumes without words, finding excuses to be in close proximity even when practical necessity didn't require it. March brought unseasonably warm weather that pulled everyone outdoors after the long grey winter. Marcus started a small garden in the backyard, teaching both children how to prepare soil and plant seeds, explaining the miracle of growth with patience he hadn't known he possessed. Elena joined them on her days off, kneeling in the dirt alongside the kids, her hands moving with sure confidence as she showed them proper spacing and watering techniques. The four of them worked together until their clothes were filthy and their faces were sunburned, and afterward they sat on the back steps sharing lemonade and watching the clouds drift overhead. It was during one of these relaxed afternoons that Daniel made an observation that had clearly been percolating in his mind for some time. He announced matter-of-factly that Elena was basically like another mom, and Lily was basically like his sister, so he didn't understand why they were all pretending to be something else. The directness of children's logic cut through all the adult complications and rationalizations, leaving Marcus and Elena staring at each other across the garden while the kids waited expectantly for a response. Elena fielded the question with diplomatic skill, explaining that families could look lots of different ways and that labels weren't always necessary, that what mattered was caring about each other and being there for each other even when things got difficult. But Daniel persisted with the tenacity of someone who had identified an inconsistency and wanted resolution, pointing out that they all lived together and ate together and did everything together, just like a regular family, so why were the grown-ups being weird about it? That evening, after the children were finally asleep following an extended bedtime routine necessitated by their refusal to stop talking about family definitions, Marcus and Elena reconvened on their porch to address the elephant that had been growing steadily larger in every room. They sat in silence for several minutes, each gathering courage, until Elena finally broke the quiet with words that came out barely above a whisper. She admitted that she didn't want to be just friends or just roommates anymore, that she had developed feelings that went far beyond gratitude or practical convenience, that she thought about him constantly in ways that had nothing to do with shared household responsibilities. Her voice trembled slightly as she continued, explaining that she was terrified of ruining what they had built, terrified of making things awkward and uncomfortable, terrified of losing the stability and safety that had allowed her to rebuild her life. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he reached across the distance between their chairs and took her hand, his calloused fingers threading through hers with a rightness that felt like coming home. He told her honestly that he had been waiting almost a year to hear her say those words, that he had been falling for her gradually since those first weeks when she had somehow made his broken house feel whole again. He had been holding back out of fear and caution and respect for everything she had been through, trying to give her space to heal without the pressure of his feelings complicating her recovery. They kissed then, finally, after months of wanting and waiting, and it felt like both a beginning and a homecoming, gentle and careful, and full of all the emotions they had been suppressing for too long. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling despite the tears tracking down Elena's face, and she suggested they needed to take this slowly for the sake of the children, and for themselves. Needed to make sure they were building something sustainable, rather than rushing into something that might collapse under scrutiny. Marcus agreed readily, understanding the wisdom in patience, even though every part of him wanted to accelerate directly to the happy ending he could now envision with startling clarity. Slow was good, slow was safe. Slow gave them room to make mistakes and course correct without destroying the foundation they had built. Slow turned out to be significantly more challenging than either had anticipated, particularly when living in the same house with two observant children who missed absolutely nothing. Dating while cohabiting required creativity and strategy that felt simultaneously ridiculous and necessary. Movie nights after the children's bedtime became their primary date activity, sitting close on the couch with their fingers intertwined under a shared blanket. They stole kisses in the kitchen when the kids were focused on homework or television. Brief moments of connection that felt simultaneously thrilling and slightly absurd, given their ages. They held hands under the dinner table like teenagers hiding from parents, exchanged meaningful glances across crowded school pickup areas, sent flirty text messages during work hours that made both of them smile at inappropriate moments. It was courting in the strangest possible circumstances, building romance within the framework of an already established domestic partnership, trying to honor the newness of their relationship while living with the familiarity of daily coexistence. They waited 3 months before officially telling the children about their changed relationship status, gathering both kids in the living room on a Saturday afternoon with exaggerated seriousness that immediately made both Daniel and Lily suspicious. Marcus tried to begin the announcement with appropriate gravitas, explaining that he and Eleanor had something important to discuss regarding their household arrangements, but Aurora interrupted before he could finish the sentence. She announced cheerfully that they were boyfriend and girlfriend now, and it was about time they admitted it, because it had been totally obvious for forever. Daniel rolled his eyes with the world-weary exasperation of someone forced to deal with oblivious adults and confirmed that, yeah, they had figured it out months ago, actually, because the grown-ups were really bad at being subtle and had been making googly eyes at each other since approximately Christmas. The children's nonchalance about the situation was simultaneously deflating and relieving, removing the dramatic weight from an announcement that had been causing both adults considerable anxiety. They moved past the revelation with barely a pause, far more interested in discussing what was for dinner and whether they could have dessert before finishing their vegetables. The world continued spinning without catastrophe, and Marcus and Elena exchanged relieved glances over the children's heads, acknowledging silently that perhaps they had been overthinking the situation from the beginning. The first year of official dating brought challenges neither had fully anticipated, growing pains inherent to blending two people's trauma responses and coping mechanisms into something functional. Elena developed a nasty bout of flu in November that landed her in bed for nearly a week, and Marcus's immediate response was to emotionally shut down, retreating into clinical caretaker mode, while his mind spiraled through worst-case scenarios, fueled by memories of his wife's final illness. He brought Elena medicine and food and changed her sheets, but he did so with mechanical efficiency rather than warmth, his face closed and his voice flat. Elena noticed his withdrawal immediately, despite her fever-induced fog. When he delivered soup on the third day, with hands that shook just slightly, she made him sit on the edge of the bed and addressed the situation directly. She pointed out gently but firmly that he had shut down emotionally the moment she got sick, that he was going through the motions of care without actually being present, that his fear was turning him into someone who performed support rather than offering genuine connection. Marcus tried to maintain his composure, but his defenses crumbled under her steady gaze, and he admitted in a voice rough with unshed tears that he was terrified, that seeing her sick brought back every moment of helpless horror from watching his wife waste away, that he didn't know how to separate reasonable concern from trauma-fueled panic. Elena took his hand and held it firmly, while explaining that she understood the fear, but couldn't allow it to drive a wedge between them, that they needed to talk through these triggers rather than letting them fester into patterns that would eventually poison their relationship. They talked for hours that day, Marcus sitting on the edge of the bed while Elena intermittently dozed off from medication, working through layers of grief and fear that he had never properly processed. Elena shared her own struggles with vulnerability, admitting that asking for help still felt like weakness, that part of her was constantly braced for abandonment and rejection, even though Marcus had proven his commitment repeatedly. They acknowledged that healing wasn't linear, that they would both have setbacks and bad days and moments when old trauma resurfaced despite their best efforts. It was the first of many such conversations, learning to communicate honestly about the messy, complicated reality of building a relationship when both people carried significant baggage from their pasts. They developed a shared vocabulary for discussing their triggers and needs, practiced using "I feel" statements instead of accusations, learned to take breaks during arguments before saying things they couldn't take back. They discovered that fighting fairly was a skill that required constant practice and conscious effort, that apologizing sincerely meant acknowledging hurt without defensiveness or excuse-making, that forgiveness meant actually letting go of resentment rather than stockpiling ammunition for future conflicts. Elena had her own struggles with independence and self-sufficiency that surfaced in ways both obvious and subtle. When unexpected expenses arose in early spring, a car repair that cost significantly more than budgeted, she immediately picked up extra shifts at the clinic, working exhausting 10-hour days, 6 days a week, until Marcus confronted her about the unsustainability of her schedule. She insisted somewhat defensively that she needed to pay her fair share, that she couldn't be the woman who needed constant rescuing, that maintaining her independence was crucial to her sense of self-worth. Marcus pointed out carefully that they were supposed to be partners, which meant carrying burdens together rather than insisting on perfect equality in every transaction, that her determination to prove self-sufficiency was actually pushing him away rather than maintaining healthy boundaries. He reminded her that accepting help wasn't the same as being dependent, that interdependence was the foundation of functional relationships, that she didn't need to prove anything to him because he already knew her strength and capabilities. They compromised eventually, Elena cutting back her hours to something more reasonable, while Marcus covered the immediate expenses with the understanding that finances would balance out over time. It wasn't about keeping score or maintaining rigid 50-50 splits. It was about both people contributing what they could when they could and trusting that things would even out across the long arc of partnership. The learning curve was steep and sometimes painful, but they both showed up consistently even when showing up was hard, even when their own issues made it difficult to extend grace and patience. They learned slowly, stumbling frequently, but always choosing to move forward together rather than retreating into protective isolation. The second year of their relationship felt different from the first, smoother somehow. as if the sharp edges of their individual trauma had been worn down by patience and time and countless hours of difficult conversation. They had learned each other's patterns and triggers, developed strategies for de-escalation, built a foundation of trust strong enough to weather the inevitable storms. The relationship required less conscious effort and allowed more natural flow, moments of joy and connection emerging organically rather than being carefully constructed. They celebrated holidays with enthusiasm and creativity that hadn't existed in either household for years. Halloween involved elaborate homemade costumes and ambitious decorating that turned their modest rental into the most popular house in the neighborhood. Thanksgiving dinner expanded to include Mrs. Chen and several of Elena's colleagues from the clinic and one of Marcus's co-workers who had nowhere else to go, the house filled with laughter and the rich smells of food and the warmth of chosen family. Christmas morning brought too many presents and not enough coffee, and children high on sugar and excitement running in circles around the living room. They built traditions deliberately, consciously creating rituals that would mark their time together and give the children memories to carry into adulthood. Friday nights became movie night, with elaborate pillow forts constructed in the living room and popcorn consumed in quantities that definitely qualified as excessive. Sunday mornings meant pancakes made by Marcus, increasingly elaborate varieties, as he expanded his extremely limited cooking repertoire beyond the basic buttermilk version. Wednesday evenings were designated for family walks around the neighborhood regardless of weather, bundling into coats and scarves during winter, chasing fireflies during summer, observing the seasonal changes to trees and gardens. Daniel had grown into a thoughtful 10-year-old who took his role as Lily's protector with endearing seriousness, walking her to class each morning and checking on her at recess and sitting with her at lunch even when his friends invited him to other tables. He had accepted Elena into his life with the same generous spirit his mother had possessed, offering affection without reservation and treating Lily as the sister he had always wanted but never expected to have. His grades continued to improve, his social circle expanded, and the shadows that had haunted his eyes since his mother's death gradually faded into something resembling normal childhood happiness. Lily had blossomed into a confident 9-year-old who possessed opinions about everything and expressed them with fearless enthusiasm, a stark contrast to the terrified silent child who had huddled in that bus shelter 2 years earlier. She had wrapped Marcus around her little finger with surgical precision, having figured out early that her big, sad eyes could extract permissions that rational argument never would. She bossed Daniel around with imperious confidence while simultaneously depending on him utterly, their sibling dynamic feeling authentic rather than manufactured. One evening in late summer, as Marcus and Elena cleaned up dinner, while the children played an elaborate game involving cardboard boxes and complicated rules in the backyard, Lily wandered inside and asked with the casual directness of childhood when the grown-ups were going to get married for real. Elena nearly dropped the plate she was washing, and Marcus froze with his hand on the refrigerator door, both of them utterly unprepared for the question despite its obvious inevitability. Elena recovered first, turning to face Lily while carefully drying her hands on a dish towel, explaining gently that marriage was a big decision that required lots of thought and conversation. Lily tilted her head with an expression that suggested she found this answer inadequate, pointing out with simple logic that they already loved each other and were already a family and did everything together, so she didn't understand what additional thinking was necessary. That night, long after both children had finally surrendered to sleep, following an extended bedtime ritual, Marcus and Eleanor sat on their porch in the comfortable silence that came from years of shared space and experience. The question Lily had asked hung between them, impossible to ignore, and finally Marcus broke the quiet by addressing it directly. He asked if Elena thought they were ready for that step, for the legal and symbolic commitment that marriage represented, and Elena was silent for a long moment before responding. She admitted that she thought she'd been ready for quite some time, perhaps longer than she had consciously acknowledged, that somewhere along the way, this temporary arrangement had transformed into something she wanted to be permanent. But she qualified immediately that readiness had to be mutual, that she needed to know Marcus was equally certain before they moved forward, that she couldn't handle being the person who wanted more than her partner was prepared to give. Marcus turned to look at her fully, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes despite her careful tone, understanding that this question carried weight beyond its surface simplicity. He thought about the past 3 years, about how this woman had entered his life with nothing but desperation and a child, and had somehow helped him become a man capable of feeling again rather than merely existing. He thought about the family they had built from broken pieces, about how his house had transformed from a mausoleum into a home, about how Daniel smiled now in ways Marcus had feared were lost forever. He told her honestly that he had never been more certain of anything in his life, that she and Lily had given him reasons to live rather than simply survive, that building a future together felt less like a decision and more like acknowledging what had already become true. The relief on Elena's face transformed into joy, and she kissed him with happiness that tasted like promises and hope. 3 months later, on a Saturday afternoon in November, exactly 3 years after that rainy Tuesday night when fate had intervened in both their lives, Marcus knelt in the backyard, while Daniel and Lily set up an elaborate obstacle course using pool noodles and cardboard boxes left over from recent deliveries. The engagement ring in his pocket felt simultaneously weightless and heavy as lead, its presence constant over the past week while he waited for the perfect moment to present it. But watching Elena laugh at Lily's imperious commands as she declared herself supreme ruler of the obstacle course kingdom, Marcus realized there was no perfect moment waiting to arrive. Perfect was right now, right here, this ordinary Saturday afternoon with grass-stained children and leftover pizza in the refrigerator and 3 years of hard-won healing behind them. Perfect was choosing each other daily through the mundane struggles and small victories that constituted actual life rather than romantic fantasy. He called both children over, his voice carrying across the yard, and they ran up breathless and curious, sensing something significant in his tone. Marcus knelt so he was eye-level with them, looking at all 3 people who had become his entire world. His son, who had learned to smile again after years of grief, this little girl who had brought chaos and joy into their carefully ordered existence, and the woman who had saved him by allowing him to save her. He told them they made a pretty good team, the 4 of them together, and both children agreed enthusiastically with this assessment. Then Marcus pulled out the ring, heard Elena's sharp intake of breath, saw her hand fly to her mouth as understanding crashed over her. He asked if they wanted to make everything official, to become a real family in every sense of the word. And then he looked directly at Eleanor with eyes that held years of gratitude and healing and love, and asked if she would marry him. Elena's tears started immediately, streaming down her face while her smile grew impossibly wide, and she said yes, first in a whisper and then louder, her voice breaking with emotion and joy and relief. Daniel whooped and tackled Marcus in a hug that nearly knocked him over, and Lily jumped up and down with excitement. She didn't entirely understand, but felt compelled to express anyway. Eleanor joined the pile, kneeling on the grass and wrapping her arms around all 3 of them, and they stayed that way for a long moment, a tangle of limbs and laughter and love. The wedding planning consumed the next 6 months with varying degrees of intensity and stress. They debated venues and guest lists, argued about budgets and priorities, changed their minds repeatedly about details that seemed crucial one day and irrelevant the next. Elena wanted something intimate and meaningful, resistant to the elaborate production that so many weddings became. Marcus agreed readily, more focused on the marriage than the wedding, understanding that what mattered was the commitment they were making to each other rather than the party that celebrated it. They settled eventually on an outdoor ceremony in early May, taking advantage of the Pacific Northwest's brief window between constant rain and oppressive summer heat. The guest list remained small by design, perhaps 40 people total, consisting primarily of close friends from work and school, along with neighbors who had watched their family coalesce over the past 3 years. Mrs. Chen received a place of honor in the front row, the grandmother figure who had witnessed every step of their journey from desperate strangers to committed partners. The ceremony took place in a public garden that Marcus and Elena had discovered during one of their Wednesday evening walks, a hidden gem tucked away from the main roads, where roses climbed trellises and stone paths wound between flowering beds. The weather cooperated beautifully, delivering a day of perfect sunshine and gentle breeze that felt like nature's blessing on their union. White chairs were arranged in neat rows, facing an arch decorated with flowers, simple and elegant, and exactly right. Lily walked down the aisle first, in her role as flower girl, taking her responsibility with solemn seriousness that made several guests smile, scattering rose petals with careful precision. Daniel followed as ring-bearer, grinning broadly at his father as he carried the small pillow bearing both wedding bands. Then Elena appeared at the end of the aisle, and Marcus forgot how to breathe. She was beautiful in a simple dress that flowed around her without excessive ornamentation, her dark hair swept up to reveal her face, her smile radiant with happiness that transformed her entirely. But more than beautiful, she was whole, healed, strong, everything she had fought so hard to become over the past 3 years. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as she walked toward him, her eyes locked on his, both of them acknowledging silently the journey that had brought them to this moment. The ceremony itself was brief, neither of them wanting elaborate rituals when simple honesty would suffice. When it came time for vows, Marcus's voice was thick with emotion, but steady as he spoke words he had spent weeks refining. He told Elena that she had taught him the difference between broken and beyond repair, that she had shown him it was possible to live rather than merely exist, that she had given his son back his laughter and given him back his heart. He promised to choose her every single day, regardless of circumstances, in the good times that came easily and the hard times that tested their commitment, because she was worth choosing, worth everything. Elena was crying openly now, tears tracking down her face and probably ruining her makeup, though she clearly didn't care. Her voice wavered but remained clear as she delivered her own vows, explaining that Marcus had shown her that home wasn't a physical location, but rather the people who chose to love you when you had nothing left to offer. He had taught her that accepting help wasn't weakness, and that letting someone past your defenses didn't mean losing yourself. She promised to be his partner and equal and home for all the days they had remaining, through whatever challenges life decided to throw their way. The officiant barely finished pronouncing them husband and wife before they were kissing, sealing their commitment with a connection that had been years in the making, and their guests erupted into cheers and applause that rang through the garden. Daniel and Lily rushed forward to join the embrace, and the 4 of them stood together for a long moment, while a photographer captured images that would fill albums for decades to come. The reception was held in a nearby community center, nothing fancy but warm and welcoming, decorated with string lights and mason jars filled with wildflowers. They ate simple food, danced to music that ranged from elegant to ridiculous, gave short speeches that made people laugh and cry in equal measure. Mrs. Chen toasted them with sparkling cider, her voice breaking slightly as she talked about watching this family form from pieces that shouldn't have fit together, but somehow created something beautiful. That evening, After the celebration had ended, and the children had finally crashed from excitement and sugar overload, both of them piled into Daniel's room because they were too wired to sleep separately. Marcus and Elena sat on their porch one final time, as an engaged couple, now husband and wife, the wedding rings on their fingers catching moonlight. The comfortable silence stretched between them, years of practice making words unnecessary, but eventually Elena broke the quiet with a question. She asked if he ever thought about that Tuesday night, about the rain and the bus shelter and the split-second decision to stop instead of driving past. Marcus admitted he thought about it constantly, about how easily he could have chosen differently, about how for 4 years he had been driving past life itself, too locked in grief to engage with anything beyond basic survival. Elena confessed that she had given up entirely that night, sitting in that shelter with no options and no hope, unable to see any path forward through the despair that had swallowed her whole. Marcus pulled her closer, his arm around her shoulders, reflecting on the strange mathematics of salvation and how helping someone else had somehow pulled him out of his own darkness. Eleanor had given him back the capacity to hope, had shown him that healing was possible even when wounds ran deep, had demonstrated through her own recovery that people could be broken without being destroyed. She and Lily had transformed his house from a tomb where he and Daniel haunted their own lives into a home where 4 people actually lived and laughed and built memories together. Eleanor pointed out gently that he had done the same for her, that his decision to stop had given her back her future when she had been certain none existed. He had offered safety and stability and patience during her most vulnerable moments, had never pressured or demanded or made her feel like a charity case, despite the massive imbalance in their initial circumstances. He had seen her at her absolute lowest and hadn't turned away, hadn't judged, hadn't tried to fix her, but had simply provided a foundation from which she could rebuild herself. They sat together in silence for a while, reflecting on the strange path that had brought them here, on how the worst nights of their lives had somehow contained the seeds of everything good that followed. Through the window they could hear Daniel's voice drifting from his room, where both children had finally settled, telling Lily some elaborate story about knights and dragons and happy endings, his imagination running wild in the way of secure children who believed good things were possible. Marcus observed quietly that they had saved each other, not in some dramatic single moment, but through years of daily choices to show up, to try, to extend grace and patience and love, even when it was hard. Elena agreed, resting her head against his shoulder, adding that sometimes the most profound rescues happened gradually, one small act of kindness building on another, until suddenly you looked up and realized you were whole again. 3.5 years after that rainy Tuesday night, when Marcus Brennan stopped for a desperate stranger, 4 broken pieces had been transformed into one complete family. Their story wasn't about perfect timing or fate or destiny in any cosmic sense. It was about the grace that emerged when people were brave enough to be vulnerable, about the healing that happened when survivors chose to help others going through similar struggles, about how family could be built from choice and commitment rather than blood ties. It was about second chances and patient rebuilding and the courage required to open yourself to love again after loss had taught you how much loving could hurt. Marcus thought about that younger version of himself, the man who had been stumbling through existence in a fog of grief and exhaustion, unable to imagine a future that contained anything beyond survival. He wished he could tell that earlier Marcus, that things would get better, that hope would return, that his son would smile again, and that he would find someone to share the burden of life with, rather than carrying everything alone. But perhaps that message wouldn't have meant anything without the years of struggle required to earn it, without the painful process of healing that couldn't be rushed or skipped or summarized into easy wisdom. The truth was that helping Eleanor and Lily hadn't magically fixed Marcus's grief or erased his trauma. He still had hard days when memories of his wife hit like unexpected waves, when the weight of single parenthood felt crushing, when fear of future loss threatened to paralyze him entirely. But having Elena beside him meant he didn't have to face those moments in isolation, didn't have to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't, could actually ask for help when he needed it, rather than white-knuckling his way through every crisis alone. Similarly, Elena still struggled with her own demons, despite the stability their marriage provided. She still had moments when she panicked about money, when she worked too hard trying to prove her worth, when old insecurities about dependence and vulnerability resurfaced. But having Marcus as a partner meant she could voice those fears rather than letting them fester, could accept support without feeling diminished, could trust that someone would catch her if she stumbled. Marriage didn't solve everything, didn't erase the difficult pasts they both carried, didn't guarantee future happiness through some mystical power. What it did was formalize a commitment they had already been living, a promise to face whatever came next together rather than alone, to choose each other repeatedly through all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that constituted a life. It meant building something intentional and sturdy enough to weather storms, creating a safe harbor where all four of them could shelter when the world felt harsh and overwhelming. As spring shifted towards summer and their first months as a married couple accumulated into a comfortable rhythm, both Marcus and Elena found themselves reflecting on how profoundly their lives had changed since that chance encounter in the rain. Neither had been looking for love or family when they collided that Tuesday night. Marcus had been locked in grief, going through motions, convinced his capacity for genuine connection had died alongside his wife. Elena had been at rock bottom, homeless and desperate, focused entirely on survival rather than any kind of future beyond the immediate crisis. But sometimes the best things emerge from the worst circumstances. Sometimes hope appeared in the most unlikely forms. Sometimes help came from unexpected directions. Marcus had thought he was rescuing Elena that night, had framed his decision in terms of being the helper rather than acknowledging his own desperate need for connection and purpose. The truth was that she had saved him just as much as he had saved her, that their healing had been mutual and intertwined from the beginning, that neither could have recovered alone the way they managed together. The children continued to grow and change with the rapid evolution of childhood, both of them thriving in ways that seemed miraculous given where they had started. Daniel had grown into a thoughtful, empathetic pre-teen who possessed wisdom beyond his years, shaped by early loss but not destroyed by it, capable of deep feelings and genuine compassion. Lily had become a confident, outgoing child who brought energy and enthusiasm to everything she touched. The terrified, silent girl from the bus shelter completely transformed into someone who believed fundamentally in her own right to take up space and be heard. They fought like siblings, argued over toys and television, and whose turn it was to set the table, tested boundaries and pushed limits in all the normal ways that children did when they felt secure enough to misbehave. But underneath the ordinary conflicts ran a bond forged through shared experience, a mutual understanding that they had both survived difficult circumstances and come out stronger, that their family had been chosen rather than assumed and was therefore something precious to be protected. Marcus often found himself watching the four of them during mundane moments, during dinner conversations, or weekend errands, or lazy Sunday mornings, and feeling overwhelmed by gratitude so intense it bordered on painful. He thought about parallel universes where he had driven past that bus shelter, where he had been too tired or cautious or self-focused to stop, where Elena and Lily had faced whatever came next alone, while he returned to his empty house and hollow existence. Those alternate timelines felt horrifying in their plausibility, a reminder of how easily his current happiness could have never existed. Elena experienced similar moments of profound appreciation, instances where she looked around their home and felt stunned by how far she had come from that desperate night when everything had fallen apart. She remembered sitting in that bus shelter with Lily shivering against her, unable to see any path forward, convinced that she had failed utterly as a mother and as a person. The contrast between that rock-bottom moment and her current life felt almost impossibly vast, a transformation so complete it sometimes seemed unreal. She had a career she found meaningful, working at the family clinic where she could form relationships with patients over time rather than dealing with the constant churn of hospital nursing. She had a home that felt genuinely safe and stable, not just a temporary shelter or a place she was terrified of losing. She had a partner who knew all her flaws and struggles and chose her anyway, who didn't demand perfection or punish vulnerability. She had watched her daughter transform from a frightened, clingy child into a confident girl with opinions and dreams, and the fundamental security that came from knowing she was loved unconditionally. The story could have ended a dozen different ways, most of them bad. Marcus could have driven past without stopping. Elena could have refused his help out of pride or fear. The living arrangement could have devolved into tension and resentment. The children could have struggled to bond. The attraction between the adults could have destroyed their friendship before anything genuine could develop. Any number of complications could have derailed them before they found their footing. But instead, through a combination of choice and effort, and probably some measure of luck, 4 damaged people had managed to build something whole. They had faced their individual trauma rather than letting it control them, had learned to communicate honestly rather than hiding behind walls, had extended grace and patience to each other during inevitable stumbles and setbacks. They had done the unglamorous daily work that sustainable relationships required, showing up consistently even when showing up was hard, choosing connection over self-protection, being brave enough to be vulnerable. One evening in late summer, almost a year after their wedding, the family gathered on their back porch for one of their traditional Wednesday walks. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and a pleasant breeze carried the smell of neighbors grilling dinner. Daniel and Lily raced ahead down the sidewalk, engaged in some competitive game that involved elaborate rules they had invented, their laughter floating back through the warm air. Marcus took Elena's hand as they walked, their fingers intertwining with the easy comfort of long practice, and neither felt any need to fill the silence with conversation. They watched their children play, observed the neighborhood cats sunning themselves on porches, waved to Mrs. Chen watering her garden. The moment held no particular significance, contained no major revelation or dramatic development, was simply one of thousands of ordinary evenings they would share over the coming decades. But perhaps that ordinariness was itself the victory, the real happy ending, hiding inside mundane routines and small contentments. The ability to have boring, normal problems like whose turn it was to do laundry or what to have for dinner, rather than catastrophic crises about survival and loss. The luxury of planning next year's vacation rather than wondering how to get through the next day. The comfort of knowing that someone would be there tomorrow and the day after, and all the days stretching into an uncertain but shared future. Marcus thought about that version of himself from 4 years ago, the man who had been so lost in grief that he couldn't see past the next task on an endless checklist of obligations. He wished he could reach back through time and tell that earlier Marcus that things would get better, that he would laugh again, that his son would heal, that he would find love in the least likely circumstances. But he also understood that the message wouldn't have meant anything without the journey required to reach this point, that healing couldn't be rushed or skipped or summarized into convenient wisdom. Elena reflected on her own past self, the woman who had sat in that bus shelter convinced she had reached the end of her options, unable to imagine any future beyond immediate survival. She wanted to tell that earlier Elena that rock bottom wasn't the end of the story, that losing everything could somehow create space for rebuilding something better, that accepting help wasn't weakness, but rather courage. But she also knew that her past self wouldn't have been able to hear those words, that desperation had its own logic that defied comfort or reassurance. The truth was that both of them had needed to go through every painful step of the journey to reach this ordinary, beautiful evening. The grief and loss, the desperation and fear, the slow, awkward rebuilding, the tentative trust, the gradual healing, all of it had been necessary to create the people they had become and the family they had built. You couldn't skip the hard parts and still arrive at the same destination, couldn't bypass suffering and expect to emerge with the same depth of appreciation for simple joys. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon and the evening air began to cool, they called the children back and turned toward home. Daniel and Lily came running, breathless and grass-stained and happy, already arguing about tomorrow's plans. Marcus and Elena followed behind, still holding hands, walking slowly to extend the moment. Their small house came into view, lights glowing warm through the windows, looking exactly like what it was. A home rather than simply a structure, a place where people lived rather than merely existed. Later that night, after dinner had been eaten and cleaned up, after homework had been completed and teeth brushed, after bedtime stories had been read and final requests for water had been fulfilled, after the house had finally settled into nighttime quiet, Marcus and Elena made their way to their own bedroom. They got ready for bed with the comfortable efficiency of long practice, moving around each other in the small space with unconscious coordination. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, removing her earrings and placing them carefully in the small dish on her nightstand. Marcus emerged from the bathroom and paused in the doorway, looking at her. This woman who had stumbled into his life broken and desperate, and had somehow made him whole again. She glanced up and caught his gaze, saw something in his expression that made her smile. She asked what he was thinking, and Marcus was quiet for a moment before answering honestly. He said he was thinking about how easily things could have gone differently, how many small choices and random chances had needed to align perfectly to bring them here. How grateful he was that he had stopped that Tuesday night instead of driving past. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling as she stood and crossed the room to wrap her arms around him. She told him that she thought about it too. Thought about it all the time, actually, about how that terrible night had somehow contained the seed of everything good that followed. She had been absolutely certain that her life was over in any meaningful sense, that she had failed completely and irretrievably, that the best she could hope for was minimal survival. She could never have imagined that the man who stopped to help would become her husband, that his son would become her son too, that they would build this family from wreckage. Marcus held her close, his chin resting on top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair and feeling her heart beating against his chest. He reflected that maybe that was the real lesson embedded in their story, that you never really knew when your life was about to change completely, that transformation could come from the most unlikely directions, that hope could appear when you had stopped looking for it entirely. The world was full of people sitting in their own versions of that bus shelter, convinced they had reached the end of their options, unable to see any path forward through their particular darkness. And the world was also full of people driving past in their own grief and exhaustion, too locked in their own pain to notice anyone else's suffering. The magic happened when someone chose to stop, when someone decided that their own struggle didn't exempt them from helping others going through similar battles, when someone was brave enough to extend a hand even when they felt empty themselves. Marcus had thought he was saving Elena that night, had framed the decision in his mind as an act of charity or kindness or basic human decency, But the truth was messier and more complicated and ultimately more beautiful than that simple narrative. They had saved each other, not through any single dramatic gesture, but through years of daily choices to show up, to try, to be patient with each other's healing, to build something intentional and sturdy from their combined wreckage. Their story wasn't unique in any cosmic sense. People fell in love after loss every day. Families were formed from choice rather than blood all the time. Single parents found partners who helped carry the burden constantly. But to them, living inside this particular story, with these particular people in this particular house, it felt like a miracle, like grace undeserved and unearned, but gratefully accepted. Elena pulled back slightly to look up at Marcus's face, her hand still resting on his chest where she could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong and alive. She told him seriously that she needed him to know something, that it was important he understood this clearly. She said that she hadn't been looking for rescue that night, hadn't been waiting for some hero to swoop in and fix her life. She had been prepared to figure things out on her own somehow, through sheer, stubborn determination if nothing else, because that was what she had always done. But what Marcus had offered wasn't rescue in some paternalistic sense, wasn't a transaction where she owed eternal gratitude for his charity. What he had offered was partnership, even before either of them understood that was what it would become. He had created space for her to rebuild herself, had provided stability without demanding gratitude, had treated her as an equal rather than a charity case. He had seen her at her absolute worst and hadn't judged, hadn't tried to fix her, had simply said, "You're going through something terrible, and I can help carry it for a while." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as he absorbed her words, understanding that she was naming something important, that this distinction mattered in ways that went deeper than semantics. He told her that he understood, that he had never thought of her as someone who needed saving in any permanent sense, that he had always seen her strength even when she couldn't see it herself. And he needed her to understand that she had done the same for him, had seen something worth nurturing in a man who had been sleepwalking through life for years, had believed he could heal even when he didn't believe it himself. They stood together in their bedroom, holding each other in the soft lamplight, both of them thinking about how far they had traveled from those desperate versions of themselves. The journey hadn't been easy or quick or straightforward. There had been setbacks and struggles, mistakes and misunderstandings, moments when giving up seemed easier than continuing to fight. But they had kept showing up anyway, kept choosing each other through the hard parts, kept extending grace when it was needed most. Eventually they got into bed, turning off the light and settling into their usual positions, Eleanor curled against Marcus's side, with his arm around her shoulders. They lay in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the house settle around them, hearing the faint sound of Daniel's sleep-talking drifting from his room down the hall. These ordinary sounds of family and home, sounds that neither of them had thought they would hear again, sounds that represented everything they had built together. Marcus broke the silence to observe quietly that their life wasn't perfect, that they still had problems and struggles, and days when everything felt hard. Elena agreed readily, pointing out that they had bills to pay and careers to manage and children to raise and all the complications that came with those responsibilities. But the difference now was that they faced those challenges together, could divide the burden and provide support, and know that someone had their back when things got difficult. She added something else that made Marcus hold her tighter, explaining that she had spent so many years believing that needing people was a weakness, that independence meant never relying on anyone for anything, that strength was measured by how much you could carry alone. But Marcus had shown her that the opposite was true, that real strength meant being vulnerable enough to accept help, that connection and interdependence were sources of power rather than liabilities. Marcus acknowledged that he had learned the same lesson from the opposite direction, that he had spent years after his wife's death trying to be completely self-sufficient, convinced that needing anyone would make him weak or vulnerable in ways he couldn't afford. But Elena had taught him that closing yourself off from connection didn't protect you from pain. It just guaranteed you would face pain alone, that sharing burdens didn't make them heavier but actually made them more bearable. They drifted towards sleep gradually, their conversation trailing off into drowsy contentment, both of them secure in the knowledge that they would wake up tomorrow in this same bed, in this same house, surrounded by this same family they had built from broken pieces. The future stretched ahead, filled with unknowns and uncertainties, inevitable challenges and changes and losses that would test their commitment in ways they couldn't predict. But they would face whatever came together, as partners, as equals, as people who had survived the worst and learned that survival was possible, that healing happened gradually through daily choice and effort, that love could grow in the least likely circumstances if you were brave enough to let it. They had learned that being broken didn't mean being destroyed, that starting over was possible at any age, that family could be found or formed or chosen rather than simply inherited. Marcus's last conscious thought before sleep claimed him was a simple one, a recognition that his life had become something worth living again, rather than something to be endured. Elena's final thought mirrored his almost exactly. Gratitude for this ordinary, beautiful life that had seemed impossible just a few years ago, flooding through her as consciousness faded. The house settled into nighttime quiet, all four of its occupants sleeping peacefully under the same roof, safe and warm and home. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky, indifferent to human drama and struggles and small triumphs. But inside that modest rental house, in a quiet neighborhood in Bellingham, Washington, four people who might have been destroyed by their circumstances had instead been transformed, had found each other in the darkness, and built something luminous together. Their story would continue through all the ordinary days and extraordinary moments that constitute a life, through joys and sorrows, victories and defeats, good times and hard times. They would make mistakes and have regrets, would struggle and stumble, would face losses that would test everything they had built. But they would face it all together, choosing each other repeatedly through changing circumstances, weathering storms that would have broken them individually, but that they could withstand as a unit. Years later, when the children were grown and gone, and Marcus and Elena were old together, they would still sometimes talk about that Tuesday night in the rain, about the impossible series of chances and choices that had brought them together. They would marvel at how easily things could have gone differently, how many ways the story could have ended badly, how grateful they were that everything had worked out the way it did. They would acknowledge that they had been lucky, that timing and circumstance had played crucial roles, but they would also recognize that luck alone hadn't been enough. What had saved them both, what had allowed their survival to transform into genuine healing, and then into love, was the daily decision to show up for each other, to be patient with the messy process of recovery, to extend grace and compassion even when it was hard, to believe that something better was possible even when the evidence suggested otherwise. They had chosen hope when despair would have been easier, chosen connection when isolation would have been safer, chosen to risk their hearts again after loss had taught them exactly how much loving could hurt. And that choice, renewed daily through countless small acts of kindness and patience and love, had made all the difference. That was the real story, the one worth telling, the one that mattered. Not a fairy tale about perfect timing or destined soulmates, but a human story about broken people finding ways to be whole together, about choosing to stop when driving past would have been easier, about extending a hand even when you felt empty yourself. Sometimes helping someone else was exactly how you saved yourself. Sometimes the worst night of your life contained the seeds of your salvation. Sometimes family was something you built rather than something you were born into. Sometimes love appeared in the least likely circumstances, emerging from desperation and rain and a split-second decision to stop instead of driving past. Their story was one of thousands like it happening all the time, ordinary miracles of human connection and resilience and grace unfolding in quiet neighborhoods and modest houses all across the world. But to Marcus and Elena and Daniel and Lily, living inside their particular version of the story, it felt like everything, like the entire universe had conspired to bring them together, like they had been saved by something bigger than themselves. And maybe they had been, or maybe they had simply saved each other, which in the end amounted to the same thing. The mechanism mattered less than the result, the explanation less than the gratitude, the logic less than the love. They had found each other in darkness and built something luminous together. They had chosen hope when despair would have been easier. They had survived and then moved beyond survival into something that resembled joy. They had become a family, not through blood or obligation, but through daily choice and commitment and love. And that, finally, was everything that mattered. The years continued to pass in their steady progression, the seasons turning from one to the next with their familiar rhythms. Spring always brought rain and flowers bursting from soil that had looked dead during winter's grip. Summer arrived with heat and long evenings when the children played outside until darkness finally forced them indoors. Fall painted the world in amber and crimson, leaves crunching underfoot during their Wednesday walks. Winter settled in with cold and early darkness, the family drawing closer around the warmth of home. Through all these cycles, the family of four grew and changed and deepened their bonds. Daniel graduated from elementary school and started middle school, entering those awkward early teenage years with more grace than many of his peers, anchored by the stability that had allowed him to process his early trauma rather than being consumed by it. He developed interests in soccer and photography, spent hours composing shots with an old digital camera Marcus bought him at a garage sale, showed genuine talent for capturing moments that revealed something essential about his subjects. Lily followed her brother into middle school eventually, bringing her characteristic enthusiasm and energy to every new experience, joining the drama club and the choir and the student council, because she couldn't resist being involved in everything simultaneously. She maintained her close bond with Daniel, even as both children developed independent friend groups and interests, the sibling relationship they had formed remaining strong despite the natural evolution of their individual identities. Marcus advanced in his construction career, his combination of skill and reliability eventually earning him a position as a senior foreman overseeing larger projects. The increased income allowed them to finally move from the rental house into a modest home they actually owned, a small 3-bedroom place with a yard big enough for Elena's expanding garden and a basement workshop where Marcus could tinker with his own projects. The mortgage felt manageable rather than crushing, a debt taken on with confidence rather than desperation. Elena continued at the family clinic, building relationships with patients that spanned years, watching children grow from infancy into adolescence, helping families navigate medical crises and health concerns with the combination of clinical skill and genuine compassion that made her exceptional at her work. She found deep meaning in the continuity of care, in being present for people across the full spectrum of their lives, rather than seeing them only in moments of acute crisis. Their marriage deepened in the way that good marriages do, moving past the initial intensity of new love into something more sustainable and profound. They learned each other's patterns so thoroughly that they could often communicate without words, could read moods and needs from tiny signals invisible to outside observers. They still had disagreements and tensions, moments when they got on each other's nerves or disappointed each other or failed to meet the other's needs. But they had learned to navigate conflict with honesty and respect, to apologize sincerely when they screwed up, to forgive without keeping score. The difficult conversations that had felt so painful in their early years together became easier with practice, until talking about fears and needs and disappointments felt natural rather than terrifying. They built trust gradually through consistency, proving to each other repeatedly that they could weather storms together, that conflict didn't mean abandonment, that being vulnerable wouldn't be weaponized against them. They created new traditions as the children grew older, adapting their routines to accommodate changing needs and interests. Friday movie nights evolved to include increasingly sophisticated films as the kids matured. Sunday pancakes expanded to elaborate brunches that sometimes included friends or neighbors. Wednesday walks occasionally became hikes in the nearby mountains, family adventures that created shared memories and inside jokes. They celebrated milestones large and small, marking achievements and growth with appropriate recognition. Daniel's first camera show at a local gallery, displaying photographs that revealed his emerging artistic voice. Lily's lead role in the school musical, her voice ringing clear and confident across the auditorium. Elena's promotion to head nurse at the clinic, acknowledging her leadership skills alongside her clinical expertise. Marcus's project winning a regional award for innovative design, recognition from professional peers who understood the skill required. But they also honored the ordinary moments that constituted the bulk of their life together, understanding that real family wasn't built during major events, but rather through accumulated small choices and daily rituals. Making breakfast together on Saturday mornings, reading side by side in comfortable silence, helping with homework that increasingly challenged the adults' knowledge as the children advanced. Watching the same movies repeatedly because they had become touchstones, maintaining running jokes that made no sense to outsiders but sent them all into fits of laughter. The extended family constellation expanded gradually as friendships deepened and roots spread through the community. Mrs. Chen remained a beloved fixture in their lives, the grandmother figure who remembered every birthday and showed up for every important event, and always had cookies available for children who visited. Elena's colleagues from the clinic became close friends, relationships that extended beyond professional boundaries into genuine affection and support. Marcus's co-workers included several who became regular fixtures at family gatherings, men who had initially been work connections but evolved into chosen family. They weathered challenges that tested their family's strength without destroying it. A serious car accident when Lily was 13 left her with a broken leg and mild concussion, bringing back Elena's medical trauma and Marcus's fear of losing people he loved. But they supported each other through the crisis, and Lily's recovery brought them all closer. Daniel's brief experimentation with drugs in high school created a 6-month period of tension and conflict, but they navigated it with therapy and honest communication and emerged with their bonds tested but intact. Financial struggles came and went, tight months when unexpected expenses threatened their careful budget, forcing difficult conversations about priorities and sacrifices. Marcus's company went through a rough patch that resulted in temporary layoffs. 3 anxious months when he worked odd jobs while waiting to be called back, their savings depleting faster than comfortable while they tried to maintain normalcy for the children. Elena dealt with workplace politics that made her question her career choices. A new clinic administrator whose focus on profit margins conflicted with her values around patient care, eventually requiring her to advocate forcefully for herself and her patients in ways that felt uncomfortable but necessary. Through all these challenges, the foundation they had built held firm. The trust and communication patterns established during their early years together served them well when facing new obstacles. They leaned on each other without falling apart, shared burdens without resentment, made it through difficult periods by remembering that struggles were temporary while their commitment was permanent. As the children moved through high school and began thinking seriously about their futures, Marcus and Elena found themselves having conversations about empty nest syndrome and what their relationship would look like once the kids left home. They acknowledged some anxiety about this transition, recognizing that their identities had become deeply intertwined with parenthood, that their daily routines revolved around the children's needs and schedules. But they also felt excitement about the possibility of rediscovering each other as partners rather than primarily as co-parents, about having time and energy for pursuits they had postponed during the intense years of active child-rearing. Daniel decided to attend art school after graduation, his photography portfolio earning him admission to a competitive program and a decent scholarship package. The process of helping him prepare to leave home brought bittersweet emotions for everyone, pride in his accomplishments mixed with grief about the ending of this chapter of their family life. Marcus found himself getting unexpectedly emotional while helping Daniel pack, remembering the small grieving boy who had barely smiled after his mother's death, marveling at the confident young man he had become. Lily was still in high school during Daniel's first year away, and the house felt strange, with only 3 of them present during the week. But she thrived in her role as the sole child at home, enjoying the increased attention and developing closer individual relationships with both Marcus and Elena. She talked about her plans for college and career with confidence that suggested she believed fundamentally in her ability to achieve her dreams, a security that came directly from knowing she had people who believed in her unconditionally. The years kept passing, as years do, bringing change and constancy in equal measure. Daniel graduated from art school and began building a career as a photographer, taking on commercial work while continuing to pursue his artistic vision. Lily went off to college across the country, studying theatre with the same passionate intensity she brought to everything she attempted. The house grew quiet in ways that felt both lonely and peaceful, allowing Marcus and Elena to rediscover rhythms that had been submerged during the active parenting years. They traveled more, taking trips they had postponed while raising children, exploring national parks and visiting cities, and allowing themselves lazy days without structure or obligation. They renovated their house gradually, updating spaces to reflect their current needs rather than the requirements of active children. They invested time in hobbies and interests that had been sidelined, Marcus expanding his woodworking skills, and Elena returning to the painting she had loved before nursing school consumed her attention. Their marriage continued to evolve, entering a new phase that felt simultaneously familiar and novel. Without children present, requiring constant attention and mediation, they had to relate to each other directly rather than primarily through their shared roles as parents. They rediscovered aspects of each other that had been obscured during the busy years, learned new things about their partner despite decades of intimacy, found ways to keep their relationship fresh and engaging rather than falling into comfortable ruts. They made it a point to maintain weekly date nights, simple outings to restaurants or movies or walks through their neighborhood, time dedicated specifically to their relationship as partners rather than as a parenting team. They talked about their dreams and fears, processed the changes happening in their bodies and minds as they aged, discussed the ways their perspectives and priorities had shifted over the years. As they moved into their 50s and then their 60s, Marcus and Elena found themselves reflecting more frequently on the journey that had brought them together, on the strange, circuitous path from that rainy Tuesday night to their current life of comfortable partnership. They had accumulated decades of shared experiences and inside jokes and memories that bound them together with cords stronger than any legal document or ceremonial vow. They had survived losses together, including Marcus's father passing away suddenly from a heart attack, and Elena's mentor from nursing school dying after a brief battle with aggressive cancer. They had celebrated victories together, witnessing both Daniel and Lily build meaningful careers and eventually start families of their own, becoming grandparents to children who called them grandpa and grandma without any qualifier or distinction based on biological connection. The grandchildren didn't know the complicated origin story, didn't understand that Daniel and Lily weren't biological siblings, or that Marcus and Elena had met when both families were essentially homeless and desperate. To them, this was just Grandpa and Grandma's house, a place of stability and warmth and unconditional acceptance, exactly the same as any other grandparent's home. And in all the ways that mattered, it was. On quiet evenings, when it was just the two of them, in their now spacious house with its empty bedrooms and accumulating photographs documenting decades of family life, Marcus and Eleanor would sit together on their porch, as they had done for years, drinking tea and watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes they talked about their children and grandchildren, expressing pride and occasional concern about the choices their kids were making and the lives they were building. Sometimes they discussed practical matters, home repairs needed, or financial planning for retirement or health concerns that increased with age, but often, especially on anniversary dates or birthdays or holidays that prompted reflection, they found themselves returning to that origin story, that Tuesday night in the rain that had changed everything. They marveled at the improbability of it all, at how many small choices and random chances had needed to align for their paths to cross at precisely the right moment. They acknowledged how easily things could have gone differently, how Marcus could have driven past without stopping, how Elena could have refused his help, how any number of complications could have derailed them before they found their footing. Marcus would often observe that stopping that night was the single best decision he ever made, that picking up a desperate stranger and her child had ultimately saved his life just as much as it had saved theirs. Elena would point out that accepting his help despite every instinct screaming at her to refuse was equally crucial, that learning to be vulnerable and accept support had been necessary for her healing. They understood now, in ways they couldn't have articulated at the time, that their recovery had been deeply intertwined from the beginning, that neither could have healed the way they did without the other's presence and support. Marcus had needed someone to care for, someone whose desperate need pulled him out of his own self-absorbed grief and forced him to engage with life again. Elena had needed the stability and patience Marcus offered, the space to rebuild herself without pressure or judgment or any expectation that she perform gratitude for basic human decency. They had saved each other not through any dramatic single gesture, but through years of daily choices to show up, to extend grace, to believe in the possibility of healing even when evidence suggested otherwise. They had learned to communicate honestly about their needs and fears, to fight fairly when conflicts arose, to apologize sincerely when they hurt each other, to forgive without keeping score. They had discovered that love after loss meant choosing vulnerability despite knowing exactly how much it could hurt, meant risking everything again after previous losses had taught them that nothing was guaranteed. As they grew older together, accumulating wrinkles and grey hair and the physical limitations that came with aging bodies, they felt grateful for every ordinary day, for every mundane conversation, for every shared meal and quiet evening and comfortable silence. They had learned that happiness wasn't found in dramatic gestures or perfect moments, but rather in accumulated small contentments, in the simple joy of waking up next to someone you trusted completely, in knowing that someone had your back through whatever challenges life presented. Their story wasn't remarkable in any objective sense. People rebuilt their lives after disasters all the time, found love in unexpected places constantly, formed families from choice rather than blood frequently. But to Marcus and Elena, living inside their particular version of the story, with their particular people in their particular circumstances, It felt miraculous, like they had been given a second chance at happiness they didn't deserve, but gratefully accepted. They understood that their happy ending wasn't really an ending at all, but rather a continuing present, a life being lived day by day, with all its imperfections and complications and unexpected joys. They had learned that sustainable happiness wasn't about finding perfect circumstances, but rather about choosing to engage fully with imperfect ones, about showing up consistently even when it was hard, about extending grace and compassion to yourself and others, about believing that better things were possible even when current evidence suggested otherwise. And on those quiet evenings when they sat together on their porch, hands linked as they had been for decades, watching the sun sink below the horizon and paint the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, they felt certain they had found something rare and precious, something worth every struggle and sacrifice required to achieve it. They had survived the worst, and learned that survival was possible, that healing happened gradually through daily choice and effort, that love could grow in the least likely circumstances if you were brave enough to let it. Their story, in the end, was about hope appearing when you had stopped looking for it, about help arriving from unexpected directions, about broken people finding ways to be whole together. It was about the grace that emerged when someone decided to stop rather than drive past, about the courage required to accept help when pride screamed at you to refuse, about the patient daily work of building something sustainable from wreckage. It was about choosing connection over isolation, vulnerability over self-protection, hope over despair, love over fear. It was about showing up for each other through the mundane struggles and small victories that constituted a life, about being patient with the messy process of healing, about believing in the possibility of transformation even when circumstances suggested it was impossible. Most of all, it was about understanding that sometimes helping someone else was exactly how you saved yourself, that the worst night of your life could contain seeds of your salvation, that family could be found or formed or chosen rather than simply inherited, that it was never too late to begin again. Marcus and Eleanor had lived that truth, had proven through decades of daily choices that recovery was possible, that second chances existed, that broken didn't mean beyond repair. They had built a family from wreckage, had chosen each other repeatedly through changing circumstances, had weathered every storm by facing it together. And sitting on their porch in the gathering darkness, hands linked as they watched the stars begin to appear overhead. They felt grateful for every moment of the improbable, beautiful, ordinary life they had created together. Grateful for that rainy Tuesday night that changed everything. Grateful for the courage to stop, and the courage to accept help, and the courage to build something new from the ruins of what they had lost. Their story would eventually end, as all stories must, but not yet. Not tonight. Tonight they were simply here together, present in this moment, alive and grateful and home. And that was everything. That was more than enough. That was, in fact, exactly right.